By the early 1980s, the communist system was showing clear signs of failure. Across the Soviet Union and its Eastern European satellite states, economic problems had become impossible to hide. Factories struggled to produce enough goods, economic growth slowed dramatically, and governments found it increasingly difficult to meet the needs of their citizens. Food shortages were common, forcing people to wait in long lines for basic necessities. Everyday consumer products that were taken for granted elsewhere were often unavailable, and routine power outages disrupted daily life. At the same time, decades of industrial neglect had created severe environmental damage throughout the USSR and Eastern Europe, leaving many regions polluted and unhealthy. While conditions worsened behind the Iron Curtain, people could see that life in the West was very different. In countries such as the United States, higher standards of living were evident. Even ordinary workers had access to a wide range of consumer goods, reliable services, and material comforts that most Soviet citizens could only imagine. As information and images from the West became harder to keep out, the gap between the two systems became increasingly obvious. For many people living under communism, the contrast was impossible to ignore, and it raised growing doubts about the future of the communist system itself. Tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union worsened rapidly after Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980. Rejecting the policy of détente that had eased Cold War tensions during the 1970s, Reagan took a much tougher stance toward the Soviet Union and signaled that the Cold War was far from over. He argued that the United States needed to rebuild its military strength and challenge Soviet expansion around the world. One of the most controversial parts of Reagan's strategy was the announcement of the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, a proposed missile defense system that critics quickly nicknamed Star Wars. The plan called for advanced technologies that could detect and destroy incoming nuclear missiles before they reached their targets. In reality, the technology required for such a system did not yet exist, and many scientists doubted it could be built. Nevertheless, Reagan successfully convinced Soviet leaders that the United States might eventually develop a shield capable of neutralizing their nuclear weapons. For the Soviet Union, the possibility was deeply unsettling. The USSR was already suffering from a stagnant economy, declining productivity, and mounting financial pressures. If the United States achieved a technological breakthrough that made Soviet nuclear missiles ineffective, the strategic balance that had defined the Cold War could be destroyed. To remain competitive, the Soviets would have to invest enormous resources into a new arms race, resources they could scarcely afford. The growing pressure became evident at a summit meeting in Reykjavik, Iceland, in October 1986, where Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev proposed sweeping reductions in nuclear weapons. Although the discussions came close to producing a historic agreement, negotiations collapsed when Gorbachev insisted that Reagan abandon SDI. Reagan refused, believing the program was essential to American security, and ultimately walked out of the talks. For Soviet leaders, the outcome was alarming. The United States appeared determined to continue a costly technological and military competition, while the Soviet economy was increasingly unable to keep pace. The Kremlin faced the reality that it was being drawn into a contest that its system could not sustain, highlighting the growing weaknesses that would soon contribute to the collapse of the Soviet Union. While Soviet leaders struggled to keep pace with the United States in military spending and technological competition, they faced an equally serious challenge at home. More and more Soviet citizens were becoming aware that life in the West offered a much higher standard of living. Through television broadcasts, visitors, magazines, and other sources of information, people behind the Iron Curtain could see the consumer goods and conveniences that were common in Western countries. Western workers enjoyed access to products that symbolized comfort and prosperity: VCRs and VHS movies, color televisions, home computers, modern kitchen appliances such as blenders and microwaves, fashionable clothing like blue jeans, and affordable automobiles. These items were not luxuries reserved for the wealthy. Many middle-class families could afford them. In contrast, citizens of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe often struggled to obtain even basic necessities. Store shelves were frequently empty, consumer goods were scarce, and long waiting lists for products such as cars and appliances were common. As a result, many people began to question the promises of communism. They increasingly wanted the same material comforts, choices, and opportunities that they saw Westerners enjoying. However, the centrally planned economies of the Soviet bloc proved unable to meet these growing expectations. The gap between what communist governments promised and what they could actually provide continued to widen, fueling dissatisfaction and undermining public confidence in the communist system. By the late 1980s, this growing frustration had become one of the major forces driving demands for reform and change throughout the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. When Mikhail Gorbachev became leader of the Soviet Union in 1985, he understood that the country faced a crisis that could no longer be ignored. Unlike many of his predecessors, Gorbachev recognized that the Soviet economy was stagnating and that the existing system could not continue without major changes. Years of inefficient central planning, low productivity, and excessive military spending had left the Soviet economy struggling to meet the needs of its citizens. In Gorbachev's view, meaningful economic reform was essential if the Soviet Union was to survive. However, he also realized that economic reform could not succeed on its own. Previous Soviet leaders, including Nikita Khrushchev and Leonid Brezhnev, had attempted limited reforms, but their efforts failed because the Communist Party refused to loosen its grip on power. Bureaucrats resisted change, officials protected their privileges, and criticism of government policies was discouraged. As long as the political system remained closed and inflexible, significant economic improvements would be nearly impossible. To address these problems, Gorbachev adopted a two-step strategy. First, he sought to restructure and modernize the Soviet economy so that it would become more efficient and productive. Second, he introduced political reforms designed to make the government more open and responsive. Gorbachev believed that giving citizens greater freedom to discuss problems and criticize officials would help expose corruption, encourage innovation, and build support for economic change. In doing so, he launched the most ambitious reform effort in Soviet history, one that would ultimately transform the Soviet Union and reshape the world. Gorbachev's first major reform was Glasnost, a Russian word meaning openness. He believed that the Soviet Union could not solve its economic and social problems unless people were allowed to speak honestly about them. For decades, the Communist Party had tightly controlled information, suppressed criticism, and punished those who challenged official policies. As a result, many problems remained hidden, while corruption and inefficiency continued unchecked. Under Glasnost, Gorbachev encouraged greater freedom of speech, press, and public discussion. He argued that Soviet citizens needed to openly discuss what was wrong with the communist system, criticize failed government policies, expose corruption, and propose new ideas for improving society. Newspapers and magazines were given more freedom to report on issues that had previously been censored, and public debates became increasingly common. Gorbachev believed that openness would unleash the creativity and initiative that the Soviet economy desperately needed. By allowing citizens to identify problems and suggest solutions, he hoped to create a more dynamic and innovative society. In his view, economic modernization required more than new policies. It required a political climate in which people could think freely, exchange ideas, and hold officials accountable. Glasnost was therefore intended to provide the openness necessary for meaningful reform, but it would also have far-reaching consequences that Gorbachev had not fully anticipated. Gorbachev's second major reform was Perestroika, meaning restructuring. While Glasnost focused on increasing openness and public discussion, Perestroika was designed to transform the Soviet economy itself. Gorbachev believed that the rigid system of central planning had become inefficient and outdated. To address these problems, he introduced reforms that aimed to modernize industry, improve productivity, decentralize some economic decision-making, and allow limited forms of private enterprise. The goal was not to abandon communism, but to make it work more effectively in the modern world. However, Perestroika could not be separated from Glasnost. As economic reforms were introduced, the new atmosphere of openness encouraged people to speak more freely about the failures of the Soviet system. Citizens openly criticized economic shortages, government corruption, and the lack of political freedoms. Historians, journalists, and ordinary people began discussing subjects that had long been censored, including the mistakes and abuses of previous Soviet leaders. As Glasnost and Perestroika increasingly overlapped, Gorbachev discovered that many citizens wanted far more than economic reform. Once people were free to debate the future of their society, many concluded that communism itself was the source of the country's problems. Rather than improving the existing system, growing numbers of people demanded fundamental political change, democratic freedoms, and competitive elections. These demands quickly spread beyond the Soviet Union into Eastern Europe, where communist governments faced similar economic difficulties and public dissatisfaction. Reform movements gained momentum across the Soviet bloc, while nationalist movements emerged within the USSR itself. For the first time since the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, large numbers of people openly challenged Communist Party rule. What Gorbachev had intended as a program to strengthen and modernize communism instead unleashed forces that increasingly called for its replacement, setting the stage for the dramatic collapse of communist governments across Eastern Europe and, eventually, the Soviet Union itself. When pro-democracy movements and popular uprisings spread across Eastern Europe in 1989, many observers expected the Soviet Union to respond as it had in the past. Earlier Soviet leaders had used military force to preserve communist rule, most notably when Nikita Khrushchev sent troops into Hungary in 1956 and Leonid Brezhnev crushed the reform movement in Czechoslovakia in 1968. As demonstrations grew and communist governments faced increasing public opposition, the world watched closely to see whether Mikhail Gorbachev would follow the same path. Instead, Gorbachev chose a dramatically different approach. Consistent with his reform policies and his desire to reduce Cold War tensions, he refused to send Soviet troops to suppress the movements. In effect, he informed the governments of Eastern Europe that they would no longer be protected by Soviet military power and would have to determine their own futures. Unlike previous Soviet leaders, Gorbachev was unwilling to use force to preserve communist rule. The consequences were immediate and historic. Without the backing of Soviet tanks, communist governments across Eastern Europe rapidly lost their ability to remain in power. Throughout 1989, one regime after another fell as citizens demanded democratic reforms, free elections, and greater political freedoms. Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania all abandoned communist rule, bringing an end to decades of Soviet domination in the region. The most powerful symbol of these changes came in November 1989, when the Berlin Wall, the physical and symbolic division between communist Eastern Europe and the democratic West, was opened and then torn down by jubilant crowds. Its fall marked the collapse of the Iron Curtain and signaled that the Cold War order in Europe was unraveling. By the end of 1989, Eastern Europe had been transformed, and the collapse of communist governments throughout the region foreshadowed the eventual dissolution of the Soviet Union itself just 2 years later. As communist governments collapsed across Eastern Europe, pressure for change spread into the Soviet Union itself. The USSR was not a single nation, but a union of multiple republics, many of which had distinct languages, cultures, and national identities. Inspired by the revolutions of 1989 and encouraged by Gorbachev's policy of openness, people throughout the Soviet republics began demanding greater autonomy and, in many cases, full independence. Nationalist movements grew stronger as citizens questioned whether the Soviet Union should continue to exist in its current form. Unlike previous Soviet leaders, Gorbachev refused to rely on large-scale military force to preserve the Union. He hoped that reform and negotiation could hold the country together, but the pressures pulling the USSR apart continued to intensify. Economic problems worsened, political authority weakened, and support for the Communist Party steadily declined. In August 1991, a group of hardline communist officials attempted a coup to remove Gorbachev from power and reverse his reforms. The coup leaders hoped to restore central control and save the Soviet system, but their effort quickly collapsed in the face of public resistance and a lack of widespread support. Instead of preserving the Soviet Union, the failed coup accelerated its disintegration by further undermining the authority of the Communist Party and convincing many republics that independence was the only viable path forward. Over the following months, republic after republic declared independence. By December 1991, the Soviet Union officially ceased to exist. The superpower that had rivaled the United States for nearly half a century dissolved peacefully, bringing the Cold War era to an end. In its place emerged 15 independent nations, including Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and the Baltic states. The collapse of the Soviet Union marked one of the most significant political transformations of the 20th century, reshaping Europe, ending communist rule across much of the region, and creating a new international order.